Hello, and welcome back to AJC's Virtual Global Forum, the premier Jewish advocacy event of the year. My name is Joyce Silberstang, and I'm a member of American Jewish Committee's Executive Council. During Global Forum, we gather to examine the critical issues facing the Jewish people in Israel. I have joined AJC missions around the world, from Mexico City to Muscat to Vienna, where we meet with government officials, thought leaders, religious leaders, and the Jewish community. I've witnessed firsthand the impact of our advocacy. We're nonpartisan. We focus on policies and values, not politics and parties. I'm deeply passionate about AJC's work. As a result, I joined AJC's Visionary Society, whose members have made a future or additional commitment to AJC through their estate and financial planning. Planned gifts ensure a brighter future for generations to come, including for the students who will be speaking in this session. If you're not already involved with AJC, join us as we continue to reimagine what's possible. For more information about how to get involved, visit ajc.org. Thank you for being with us today and enjoy the program.
Hi, I am Jeannette Kaplun Braun, and I am an American Jew, a Latina Jew, living in Miami with a French first name, married to a Jew from Peru. A lot of people find it a little bit complicated because they can't even fathom that diversity reigns supreme in our Jewish community. But our differences really don't need to divide us. I am the proud daughter of Chilean immigrants who themselves are grandchildren of immigrants from Ukraine, Poland, and Romania. And they immigrated to South America. So we eat ceviche and gefilte fish. We say Baruch instead of Baruch. But a simple Shabbat Shalom always connects us to our fellow Jews, regardless of where we're at, where we grew up, or even the country that we're living in. Because we are connected. We are one people, whether we're Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian. Unfortunately, there is something else that also connects us, the scary rise of anti-Semitism. To this day, for me, it's kind of unreal that I am the only Jew that many of my friends in school and college have ever met. The only Latina that they have met that is not a Christian. The only Jew that my fellow bloggers, social media influencers, and even journalists have ever had a face-to-face conversation with. And you can imagine that sometimes it gets very uncomfortable when they ask you, oh, but what does being a Jew really mean? Because you're not like other Jews. And when I ask them to clarify what they meant by that, well, the answers sometimes come riddled with every anti-Semitic trope that you can ever imagine. Yes, including, how can I support Israel when I'm an American? I could get angry, right? Because how can this be happening in 2021? But instead of being angry, I take it as a teachable moment. As a Latina Jew, I feel it's an opportunity to educate, sometimes to explain, and other times confront. Social media can be quite scary sometimes. But on the other hand, it gives us the opportunity to fight ignorance. And history has taught us over and over again how dangerous it is to combine ignorance plus hatred. We are too often seen as the others or the scapegoats. Let's refuse to be simply victims because there is beauty in diversity. And we are all connected. We are one people, and our Jewish values connect us. It's so comforting to see how much beauty there are in different traditions, regardless of our accents of how we might pronounce a prayer. During the pandemic, baking challah grounded me, and my Jewish values have always, always guided me. So, regardless of where we come from, of where we live, of our traditions, let's see that connection and understand that we must stand together, now more than ever. I am a proud American Jew.
afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Dina Siegel Vann, Director of AJC's Belfer Institute for Latino and Latin American Affairs. Through our institute, AJC actively engages the Western Hemisphere, a region which remains on the front lines, confronting a global context in which democratic principles are increasingly under assault and the threat of terrorism is real. Despite dire challenges, its governments and societies, except for a few, continue to be anchored in a culture of democracy and human rights. Minorities, including thriving Jewish communities throughout the Americas, have benefited from a climate of respect for diversity. But the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States and elsewhere has made the need to face this scourge, as well as the continued global terrorist threat, a regional priority. The Organization of American States, the oldest and most prominent multilateral organization in the Western Hemisphere, plays an outsized role in promoting collaboration among its 35 member states in the areas of democracy, human rights, security, and development. AJC was granted NGO status by the OAS in 2005 and has remained a steadfast supporter of its critical mandate. Today's issues facing the OAS are daunting, from the pandemic to refugee crisis, from populism and authoritarianism to Iranian, Chinese, and Russian forays into the region. No one has been better suited than the organization's visionary and courageous Secretary General to speak up loudly and clearly and rally the conscience of the Americas behind the core principles of the OAS. A lawyer, diplomat, and politician, AJC first had the privilege of meeting Secretary General Luis Almagro when he served as Foreign Minister of Uruguay. Then as now, we found him to be profoundly thoughtful, fair-minded, principled, and passionate, an unwavering and fierce advocate of our shared causes, whether defending democracy, pursuing justice for the AMIA case, standing up against terrorist entities such as Hezbollah or Hamas, or strengthening the hemisphere's partnership with Israel to help address regional challenges. And we take special note of his steadfast and outspoken solidarity with Israel during the latest chapter of Hamas violence. AJC deeply values Luis Almagro's inspired leadership of the OAS and is proud to call him an ally and a friend. This is why in 2019, we presented him with AJC's Champion of Democracy Award on this global stage. Upon receiving it, he made history by both adopting the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism and recognizing Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And that is why we're inviting him to address us once again on this global stage. Luis, muchas gracias for everything you do and for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Dina. Gracias, David. Thank you so much for your warm introduction. I feel truly privileged to have been invited by the American Jewish Committee to address a global audience committed to the preservation of the values of democracy and human rights. As we know, doing so entails combating all forms of racism and xenophobia, like anti-Semitism and the terrorist attacks of such groups that promote anti-Semitism. I'm happy to be here, for the AJC has always been an indispensable OAS institutional and personal partner, helping bolster causes that are at the center of the OAS mandate. Thus, I have adopted the IRA working definition and designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization back in 2019, and I have been working hard to ensure that the countries of the Americas follow suit. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism continues to raise its ugly persistence in the hemisphere, and due to the current episode of violence in Israel and attacks the Jewish state permanently suffer at the hands of terrorist Hamas, we are witnessing anti-Semitic campaigns in many places, trying to delegitimize Israel and calling for its disappearance. That is the reason why, as you might be aware, we have continuously declared our solidarity with the State of Israel in its rights, and also why we have unambiguously and unequivocally declared Hamas a terrorist organization, urging others in the Americas to do so as well. As my good friend David Harris has said, this is a moment for moral clarity and no moral foe. I want to say it loud and clear. Calling for the disappearance of the State of Israel is itself an act of terrorism. And it also is, plain and simple, anti-Semitism. Our hemisphere, impacted by the pandemic and experiencing a weakening of the democratic fabric in several societies, is facing an uptick in anti-Semitism, which threatens all minorities and endangers the principles of inclusion, respect for diversity, and social peace promoted by the inter-American system. Around the world, the growth in anti-Jewish attitudes and behavior has led different nations, including the US and Canada, to establish commissioners to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. The European Union, homologous to the OAS, has a coordinator on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life. We are convinced that our hemisphere needs to be adequately prepared to face the global threat of anti-Semitism in the same way that many other nations and democratic international bodies are doing so. Anti-Semitism has had dramatic and violent dimensions. We ought not to forget several tragic instances: the terrorist attack against AMIA in 1994, the use of anti-Semitism as an ideological political tool in the hemispheric dictatorship, the terrorist attack against the embassy of Israel in Argentina, and the vile attack against the Chilean Jewish community, all clear examples of threats not only against Jewish communities, but against the societies to which they belong. For all these reasons, I am pleased to announce today from this AJC stage that I have issued an executive order to establish the position of Commissioner of the OAS for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. I can tell you that among her main responsibilities will be, first, to actively promote adoption and implementation by all countries in the region of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and second, to vigorously engage member states and civil society organizations in the hemisphere to raise awareness of the need to remain alert to all forms of anti-Semitism, those that manifest themselves through terrorist acts, as well as those that do so more in subtle ways. Towards that end, AJC and the OAS are already working on the publication of a Latin American version of the handbook for the practical use of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, authored by the European Commission. We have been discussing different forms of cooperation with our homologous European Union on these issues, a synergy that will strengthen our shared values and principles. In addition, following the United Nations, the European Union, and several other international organizations, the OAS has also applied for membership as an institutional partner of the IRA. It is our hope that all these critical steps will help and secure not only the well-being of Jews and other minorities in the region, while consolidating democratic values and practices. This will send the clearest of messages that Latin America has no tolerance today and in the future for the destructive forces of anti-Semitism and terrorism. Thank you very much.
Those of you who know me know that I'm rarely speechless, but I'm quite speechless at the moment. I think what we've just heard from our dear friend Luis Almagro is nothing short of historic. Indeed, I would say, as we said in 2019 from the stage in Washington, that you have just heard history being made from the American Jewish Committee Global Forum. Luis referred to the notion of moral clarity as opposed to moral fog. I want to speak for a moment about moral clarity as a manifestation of moral courage. Luis Almagro, the former foreign minister of Uruguay, a very friendly country, and currently the Secretary General of the OAS, the 35-nation hemispheric body, has just said to us and said to the world for the first time that the that by executive order, the OAS will establish a commissioner whose job it will be to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, both from the perspective of the OAS and to encourage individual member nations to follow suit. We have also heard a clarion call in defense of the State of Israel, its right to exist and to defend itself, very clear words with respect to Hamas and Hezbollah, with respect to the importance of Holocaust memory and the protection of Holocaust memory. Frankly, I can't remember another speech that was as brief, Luis, and contained as many milestones as yours now. So on behalf of a grateful American Jewish committee, and with a big shout out to you, Dina Siegel Vann, and your longtime friendship with Luis, and the cooperation between the Belfer Institute and OAS, I could not be happier. Luis, we are grateful to you, and let the world know that moral courage and moral clarity have a home in the office of the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, who has just made history. Muchas gracias. Toda rabah. Thank you, Luis.
Good evening. My name is Avi Mayer, and I'm AJC's Managing Director of Global Communications. Has anti-Semitism become mainstream? It's a question many Jews across America and around the world are asking themselves after the events of recent weeks. As Jews have been assaulted by thugs wearing Palestinian flags, as synagogues have been defaced with hateful graffiti, and as massive demonstrations have featured explicitly anti-Semitic signs and slogans, some public figures have risen in condemnation, others have issued mealy-mouthed statements, and others still, including celebrities, journalists, and elected officials, seem intent to fan the flames. Jews and their allies are left to wonder, is this the new normal? With us to discuss what we're seeing, how we got here, and how we might chart a path forward are three leading thinkers and writers on the subject of anti-Semitism today. Bret Stephens, an opinion columnist with the New York Times, Weiss, a prominent journalist and writer, and Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, director of AJC Europe. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start with a question for all three of you, starting with you, Bret. How did we get here? The events of recent days and weeks didn't just materialize out of nowhere. Where did they come from?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a long answer, but there has been a process of the renormalization of anti-Semitism dressed up in the guise of anti-Zionism going on for actually for 50 years, ever since, or at least 46 years, ever since the UN declared that Zionism is racism. And I want to underscore this point because there's a kind of a factitious distinction between the two. I mean, what is anti-Semitism? It isn't simply racism against Jews, okay? Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory which holds that Jews are imposters and swindlers. And in the 19th century, the view was that Jews were imposters as Germans, imposters as French, imposters as Britons, and so on. They didn't really belong. And furthermore, that they were swindlers. They were stealing the wealth of the countries they had joined. What is anti-Zionism? It's the view that Jews are imposters and swindlers. They are imposters in the sense that they are pretending to be Middle Eastern, but actually are from somewhere else, have no connection to the land. And they're swindlers in the sense that they are stealing what belongs to other people. And that is the thread, the defamatory thread, which not only connects anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but shows that essentially they're identical, that it's the same, it's the old wine in a new bottle. And forces, even those who are doing so unwittingly, have been normalizing this view, Avi, for decades. And I think in the last few years, not only has it been normalized on the fringes of political discourse, it's being normalized in the center. I'll just say one more thing. I think that the Jewish community has too often let down its guard. We've been so terrified of being called McCarthyites or being seen as people associated with forces on the right that we have failed to call out in a clear and clarion way this connection, this identicality. And the result is that not only are Israelis at risk from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv to Sderot, they're now at risk in West Hollywood, in London, and on the streets of New York City.
Oh, thank you for that, Bret. Same question for you, Bari. How did we get here? What are the roots of the situation we're seeing today?
I mean, obviously seconding all of what Bret just said so articulately. What I would add is that I think we are now seeing the fruits of what this ideology that cloaks itself in the language of social justice, of intersectionality, of progress, and of civil rights has actually gotten the Jewish community of America. Meaning there was this sense among large segments of the Jewish community that it's more important for us to have a seat at a table with people that are hostile to us than not have a seat at that table. And so there was a kind of witting self-erasure, self-abnegation, a sense that like if we diminish this part of ourself or play down our Zionism or play down ideas of Jewish particularism, that somehow we will come to be accepted. And the allyship that we will extend to these communities will therefore be extended to us in kind. I think that the past month, I hope, has disabused people of the idea that a strategy that requires Jews to sacrifice their own identity, their own dignity, to whitewash their history gets us absolutely nowhere. The other thing that I think became extremely clear, right? If you have an ideology that says white people can't be victims, and the second part of that logic is Jews are white people, you will begin to understand why there is no corporate communications from the same people that had so much to say over this summer, even over the past months, as Asians are getting beaten in the streets of places like San Francisco and Oakland and New York. If Jews are white people, which is what the ideology of critical, it's an imperfect, it's an imperfect moniker, but when critical race theory or critical social justice or totalitarianism from the left, as I think about it, is put into practice, what it actually means for us is that we do not count. An ideology that is binary and that divides the world into white and black, oppressed and oppressor, collectively guilty or collectively innocent, in which we fall on the wrong side of all of those binaries, we shouldn't be surprised, as so many in our community seem to be, that, allyship and concern and empathy, for people who are able to find even the tiniest microaggression is not extended to us when caravans are driving through the streets of North London saying, fuck the Jews and rape their daughters, or driving through the streets of West Hollywood saying, who is a Jew, and then beating people, right? So I hope that if something good, or if there's a silver lining to come out of these past few weeks, it's that I hope people to some extent have been mugged by the reality of this ideology and understand that, if we look to Jewish history, protection and safety and security for us never comes when we give in to ideologies that require us to erase ourselves. And so the last thing I'll say is that, not to bang on so hard about the Jewish community that I love so much, but I also think there was this sense that, I remember being in so many meetings with different Jewish organizations saying, look at this incredible success. BDS has never been adopted by any college or any university. Well, BDS was an absolutely enormous cultural success. As Bret said, a success that has its roots in Soviet Union propaganda, which, most 18-year-olds who are proclaiming it have no concept of. But regardless, you don't need to have a university adopt BDS in order for BDS to have swallowed the culture. And Andrew Sullivan had this column a few months ago, maybe it was a year, it said, we all live on campus now. And I think, that has been very, very true on this issue. when Bella Hadid and, your every influencer, it feels like, is mouthing these things, I think one other lesson we should take from this is to take ideas seriously. And the ideas that had their nucleation point at the university have now come to sort of swallow the entire culture.
There's certainly a lot to unpack there, and we'll do that in just a moment. But before we do, Simone, same question for you. How did we get here? What are the roots of the situation we find ourselves in today?
So first of all, both Bret and Bari said much already, and I second really all of it. Maybe just sort of to give a little bit of a European perspective in terms of the, America exports a lot to the world, the movie industry, the high-tech industry. Europe is often lagging behind. Unfortunately, in the issue of anti-Semitism, that's not the case. So we have had a little bit of an experience, and really for the past 20 years. And AJC has recognized and spoken about the resurgence of anti-Semitism really since 2000 and 2001. It was long called in Europe new anti-Semitism. Now, 20 years on, it's not so new anymore. But what was new then? Again, Bret described much of it, and he mentioned the racism is Zionism is racism initiative at the UN. There was also the Durban conference that happened exactly 20 years ago, a conference under the auspices as well of the UN in South Africa that was supposed to be about anti-racism and ended up being basically a hate fest against Israel, against Zionism, against ultimately Jews. And so it was in this configuration that Jews were no longer seen as the enemy race, as it used to be the case under Nazism, but it was the case that that by instrumentalizing anti-racism, anti-Zionism suddenly became the racist ideology, and the Jew and the Zionist and Israel the ultimate evil. And this is something I think that really over the past 2 decades has really been growing a lot, in particular on the progressive left in Europe. The second aspect, which I think is related, even chronologically, is the fact that 9/11 happened just a couple of days after Durban. And that the anti-Zionism, the anti-Semitism happened in Europe, in particular also from within parts of the Muslim community, who have really made anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism the backbone of their worldview, and really established much of their thinking based on that. Of course, there are several elements to it. Part of it is jealousy. Part of it is deep-rooted anti-Semitism. Part of it is also sort of an identity crisis of many Muslims in Europe who feel that, that Israel or Zionism represents somehow the new colonialist power. Don't forget that in Europe, many Muslims, many Arab Muslims, have roots in Algeria and countries that have been colonized in the part. And of course, also the huge increase of radical Islam, of which, of course, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are the backbone. So all of this, I think, has really created a very dangerous cocktail in Europe. And this is one of the reasons why, in France, we use a term called Islamo-gauchisme, which means sort of Islamo-leftism. The idea that, you have the anti-imperialist far left that creates an alliance with Islamist forces on the ground. And this is why when you look at the demonstrations in Paris, in Brussels, in Germany, in London, you have this mix of far left voices together with really radical Islamist voices on the ground.
Thank you, Simone. Bari, I'd actually like to go back to you because you started your remarks with a reference to this new ideology that's threatening to undermine American liberalism and poses grave threats to Jews, as you've written on several occasions. Could you go into what that new ideology is and why it is the Jews to be so deeply concerned about it?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's an ideology that undermines liberalism. So I really believe, to kind of cut to the chase, that any initiative that's focusing on sort of anti-Semitism qua anti-Semitism and isn't focusing on the roots of where this is coming from is destined to fail. This ideology undermines everything that makes America exceptional. It basically says that because it's even deeper than America. It really goes back to Enlightenment values. Like, because the ideas of the Enlightenment were created by dead white men who had terrible ideas about any number of minority issues, or because the founders themselves were moral hypocrites and some of them were slavers, it means that the ideas themselves that those people came up with are rotten to the core. And therefore, the institutions and the ideas and this sort of amazing scaffolding that we live in needs to be undermined from within. That is the answer for it on one foot. What it looks like practically is it basically says, the old ideas of, being able to debate and disagree, the idea that we are all created in the image of God, the idea that we're all entitled to equality under the law, the idea that we don't hold individuals guilty for the sins of their parents. This is fundamental. The idea that the way that we judge an idea is not based on the identity of the speaker, but the quality of the truth claim that they're making. I could go on and on and on. These are ideas that we all, I think, in America have taken for granted. Like, they seemed as obvious as gravity. And I think what's happening now, and I find myself in so many debates having to defend these things that I grew up in a world where we took them for granted. The reason is because this ideology has been so effective at undermining them in not from the far right, but undermining them from the language of historical justice, repair of past suffering, the new civil rights movement. And I could go on and on and on. I've written about this extensively. And so an ideology that divides the world, as we know very well from recent history in Europe, that divides the world into pure and impure, that divides the world into good or bad, forces of light, forces of darkness. This is just a new way of doing that. And anyone who has studied Jewish history knows extremely well where that winds up. And I think one of the way that it's functioning here in America, right, is on the far right. It's really interesting because you just see the way that we're being squeezed in opposite directions. On the far right, what the far right says about us is that we're like the greatest trick the devil has ever played. We appear to be white, but in fact, we Jews are loyal to Black people and brown people and immigrants and Muslims. When the people in Charlottesville marched with their tiki torches shouting, "Jews will not replace us," that was what they were articulating. When Robert Bowers, the murderer, the neo-Nazi, walked into the synagogue where I became a bat mitzvah, Tree of Life, the reason he chose that synagogue was that the previous Shabbat, Tree of Life had participated in this highest initiative of Refugee Shabbat. And yet, on the far left, they are making the exact mirror image claim. They are saying, these Jews are the ultimate white people. They say that they're victims. They say that they're subjected to more hate crimes based on their religion than any other group. But look at them. They've achieved so much. They have success far in excess of their proportion of the population. They benefit from white privilege. They benefit from a white supremacist system. And not only that, not only are they guilty of being white supremacist adjacent, they are also loyal to the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. And so that is the way, practically speaking, whatever its jargon that tries to confuse you, that is how this ideology functions. And so I think it's very important for the Jewish community to not be taken in by incredible marketing and slogans, and to look under the hoods of these movements and see what they're really about.
Thank you for that, Barry. Bret, you wrote 2 weeks ago that Jews should view recent instances of violent anti-Semitism that are tied to Israel less as an outrage than as an omen. What exactly did you mean by that, and what should American Jews do about it?
Well, this goes, I think, to some extent to what Simone said earlier, which is that what we are witnessing in the last month or so in the United States vis-a-vis position of the Jews seems to me very similar to what I was witnessing in Europe when I was working in Brussels in the late 1990s and the first few years of this century, which is the Europeanization of the Jewish question here. And that's manifest in some ways that are quite visible. Every time I pass a synagogue, I see a police presence outside. I see barricades. I see security measures that certainly I never encountered at the end of the 20th century or even the first few years of this one. But you're seeing it in invisible or maybe less visible ways as well. And here I really want to touch on what I thought were Bari's really extraordinary and profound remarks. Look, it's very easy to spot the extreme anti-Semitism of the right because they're, as Bari said, with tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. They couldn't make it more obvious, right? It's more difficult to see the anti-Semitism coming up from the left for a variety of reasons. One is that traditionally, most Jews have been people of the left, right? That is sort of our political tribe. Not mine, as I think many people know, but generally speaking, our political tribe has emerged from forces associated with the left, whether it was in France in the 19th century or in the United States during the Roosevelt era and onward. So it's always more difficult to see it coming from your side. Secondly, and this goes to what I said earlier, there's a kind of semantic wordplay where the view is, well, not only is anti-Zionism not anti-Semitism, but it's an outrage to describe someone as an anti-Zionist, who's an anti-Zionist, as perhaps a presumptive anti-Semite, not least because they share so many of the same tropes and the same prejudices. But the third reason, and this is, I think, very important, is that the left, for better and worse, controls the high towers of culture, right? And if you think that to some extent, cultural attitudes about what is taboo and what is not taboo, kind of trickle down from the top. This is not trickle down economics. This is trickle down culture theory, and I think there's something to be said for it. Then that poses a particularly unique danger because what we're finding on college campuses, and Bari was absolutely right. It doesn't mean just because you didn't pass the BDS resolution doesn't mean it hasn't become a BDS campus. Is that the culture has been saturated, the high culture, the elite culture has been saturated with anti-Zionist and effectively anti-Semitic tropes, which are now spreading through kind of the lower stages of American culture. It's okay now to say that Israel is the most repressive, colonialist, genocidal state in the world. Leave aside the fact that that is a bonkers point of view. It's okay to say that. It is okay to say that Israel is gratuitously murdering Palestinian children, apparently because that's something Israelis do, just as that was something Jews supposedly did in 12th century England. There are no taboos connected to this. You know, I was in the Village the other day in Manhattan when one of these Palestinian caravans came through on the back of trucks driving alarmingly fast down McDougal Street and intimidating everyone. And what's significant isn't that these people represent some huge number, some huge force, right? They don't represent a huge force. What's significant is they weren't ashamed of doing what they were doing. What's significant is they knew that at least on some of those street corners, they were being met with cheers. What's significant is, and Bari put this point very, very well, what's significant is that when the attacks are made against Jews, it is incredibly to elicit a statement from a chancellor of a university like Rutgers, okay, to say, I condemn anti-Semitism, period. Not, and I also condemn every other form of racism and xenophobia and misogyny and transphobia and so on. I condemn anti-Semitism, period. And after he issued this mealy-mouthed statement, he apologized for it the next day. And that is why I underscore the fact that this is an omen of where the culture is going if the American Jewish community doesn't start to think seriously about what it owes itself and what it is owed by the rest of the American community.
I mean, Avi, just to add one thing to that I think was a signal event that I hope everyone noticed, in addition to everything Bret just said. The head of diversity at Google wrote a blog post saying, if I were a Jew, I would be concerned about my insatiable appetite for war and killing. And he still works at Google. So like this, I don't know if people can grasp the extent to which this ideology has permeated like the institutions that are meant to uphold the liberal order. They have fully infected a lot of these places. And I think one thing that's happening right now inside the community is that the idea of this having spread so wide and so far is literally so psychologically difficult to be able to process and absorb that people would rather close their eyes and ears to what we've already lost. And I would simply suggest to people like, yes, we have a lot to grieve right now, but let's try and get over the grieving period as quickly as possible so we can get on to figuring out how we can defend what has been for Jews the best diaspora experience in all of Jewish history. I think right now we're feeling like we're being sort of like tugged back into the mean of Jewish history. And the only way that we can resist that is by standing up loudly now, because it will not get easier. And if it feels hard right now, think about how it's going to feel 6 months, a year, or 2 years from now.
So I do want to get to you, but I actually want to pivot right back to you, Bret, because you said something at the end there that I think bears some discussion. You said that American Jews need to focus on what they owe themselves and what they are owed by American society. What does that mean? What are your marching orders for American Jews right now in light of the moment that we find ourselves in?
American Jews owe themselves the self-respect to insist that their security, that their rights, that their place at the table is not something they should apologize for, nor, by the way, is their success in American society. And I focus on that last point because the notion that somehow my mother, who came to this country as a displaced person with $7, is a beneficiary of unearned white privilege is extraordinarily offensive to the amount of struggle that she had to endure so that her children could flourish in this country. So that's where it begins. It begins by Jews in the United States to not apologize, to not preface their self-defense with expressions of allyship and correct thinking, and not to say that allyship is bad or anything like that, but it's always this reflexive apology on the part of so many American Jews when Jews are being attacked in streets, when Jews feel increasingly insecure, when our political affinity, our natural political affinity toward the state of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, is considered an expression of racism, and for which college kids are supposed to apologize by way of an entry ticket into what is supposed to be respectable liberal opinion. And Barry and I are old friends, so it's not surprising that we are agreeing. So I think emphatically here. But if we don't do that, if we don't learn what every other ethnic group in the United States, whether it's Irish American or Black American or Puerto Rican Americans, learn that you don't earn your place at the table in the United States with a preemptive apology or by denouncing the sins of your cousin, the alleged sins of your cousins in Israel, you will never keep that place at the table. That is a bad method of doing politics. It's a bad method of teaching your children to be proud of their extraordinary heritage.
Thank you for that. Now, Simone, you've been here before. As a European Jew, you've seen violent anti-Semitism coming from multiple sources, from the far right, the hard left, and from radicalism perpetrated in the name of Islam. As you are now head of AJC Europe and you observe what's happening in America, what do you make of it? What lessons should we be learning from your experience?
So first of all, I couldn't be happier to have this conversation because I have to say I've been frustrated for many, many years because sort of, you have the impression that you are watching things from abroad and you sort of see the signs and that people are extremely slow in waking up. So first of all, maybe just a little bit of context here. First of all, I think that we have invested for 20 years at AJC in Europe, and I think we have accumulated an experience and a knowledge that basically no one else has. And so for me, this is why it's so important to use that knowledge and that experience and try to sort of help our American brothers and sort of really help them understand what's going on. Exactly 6 years ago, in preparation of this panel, I realized that Bret and I were sitting at a panel together with Jeffrey Goldberg, and the topic was, do Jews have a future in Europe? And my dear American friends, Bret, you included, believed that we didn't have a future as European Jews. And I, on my end, tried to make, I think, 2 points. The first was that I believe that we cannot and should not abandon the battle in Europe because I believe, and still do, that the future of the entire continent is at stake because if the battle against anti-Semitism is lost, the entire continent is lost. The second point I try to make is that because I think we live in a globalized world, basically no liberal democracy is exempt from that cancer. And when I look back to those 6 years ago, I'm sad to say that I think I was right, that there were already elements 6 years ago that sort of showed that something was starting to get extremely wrong on the American side. But let me now go sort of a little bit to sort of the lessons, if I can say so. Of course, first of all, of course, America is different than Europe. But by the way, Europe as a whole is different. Yeah, there are 30 countries or 28 countries. Not every country is the same, and the situation is different in each one of them. But the first one is related to, I think, to what I said earlier on, and what I tried to explain during the panel 6 years ago. I think because Jews are the canary in the coal mine, because they are the alert system that something is profoundly wrong in our liberal democracies, I think anti-Semitism can never, ever be the problem of Jews alone. If it's only us, if it's only Jews who are speaking out, we have a serious problem. And it's the problem, by the way, I think had in Europe at the beginning of the years of 2000, because we were alone. People were not listening to us. People were thinking we were paranoid. We were alone. So I think that's the first very important lesson. We have to try and find ways to urge others to speak out and get them to understand that, at the end of the day, this is just the beginning. It's not going to end there. The second, and Bari, you pointed towards this, is the fact that unless you also deal with the underlying issues of anti-Semitism, the illiberalism, the polarization, the hard left and hard right, identitarianism, the fight against anti-Semitism is going to be just, you're just going to put a plaster on you're not going to be able to deal with the actual disease. The second one, and this I'll try and be short because we discussed it already, is there are indeed 3 forms of anti-Semitism, and each one has to be treated differently. Each one, you can't politicize the issue of anti-Semitism. If you start playing a political game where you just accuse the other side of being anti-Semitic, this is just playing politics. You're not going to get anywhere. But also, I think more specifically, it's important to understand that particularly on the left, as we've said before, it's difficult to speak about it. It's, everybody recognizes neo-Nazis. Everybody is able to say, there's something wrong with the hard right. It's more complicated when it's about the hard left, because it hides behind something, that looks virtuous, that looks right. It uses terms that look right. And third, and this is particularly important, I think, in the European context, but is not entirely untrue, I think, also for the American context, is that minorities can suffer from racism, but also be anti-Semitic. It took Europe a very long time to analyze and admit that, you know, European Muslim communities had a problem. Of course, not everybody, but the minorities, that there was a problem there. You know, sometimes for the good reasons, because people didn't want to stigmatize a community that itself was already suffering from racism. But I think unless we understand at the end of the day that we have to listen to the voice of the individual, rather than looking at people in, you know, as group of victims and oppressors, we're not going to get anywhere. And I'm going to stop here.
A lot. Thank you, Simone. I'm actually going to stick with you and let you be the first one to answer this question, which I'll ask of all three of you. Suppose you were to get a phone call from the White House and President Biden were to call you into the Oval Office and say, Simone, I know that anti-Semitism is a problem in the United States. I'm aware of this issue. What should I do about it? What would you tell him?
So first of all, actually, I would invite him for Shabbat. Maybe can spend 2 hours instead of a couple of minutes. And suppose he says yes, which of course I'm sure he would. No, very seriously. I think I would speak to him about the need for clear political leadership. I expect the president, the entire the administration, the entire political class to speak out forcefully, right away, clearly, without trying to minimize the issue. I have unfortunately seen too many American leaders in the past weeks speak about anti-Semitism and other isms or other obias. Anti-Semitism has to be dealt with in its own right, and right away and forcefully. The second thing I would say is that there needs to be a very clear zero tolerance strategy. There can't be a feeling of impunity, which is of course heightened due to social media, where basically you can say or do whatever you want to without any really real consequences. But I think, you know, you as Americans, you created the broken glass theory of crime prevention, where the idea is that, you know, if you delay the repair of even a single broken window, it will only create more incivility and it will only create more violence. And I think the same is the case with anti-Semitism. If you don't act right away, if you're not forcefully condemning anti-Semitism, if you don't intervene on a political and police level, you have a problem. And then the third one, and I know this is controversial in the American context, is the fact that we have to try and find a way to deal with hate speech and incitement on social media. And I don't think it can be left entirely in the hands of big social media companies. Now, again, I understand we are in a very different context. The First Amendment is, of course, very important. But again, I think we find ourselves in this very odd situation, you know, where you can have Hamas, where you can have Khamenei say the most horrific things, and other accounts are being deleted. So I think, you know, we have to have clear rules, and those clear rules need to apply to everybody.
Thank you, Simone. Bret, same question for you. You get a call from the White House and it says, POTUS wants to hear your opinion in 3 minutes on what he can do to fight anti-Semitism in America. What do you tell him?
Well, I think maybe the one area in which I might disagree with Simone is I am very suspicious of hate speech policing and regulation, just because I'm zealous about the First Amendment. Not that I don't denounce and decry it, but I'm worried about the inevitably unintended consequences of that kind of regulation. But what I would say to President Biden is this: at least a few of us who are traditionally on the right have tried to do our part in denouncing unequivocally and at any cost to us in terms of position or prestige, the anti-Semitism that has unmistakably come from the right, particularly in the last few years, sometimes nakedly in the form of the Charlottesville marchers, sometimes a little bit dressed up in the form of the opposition to so-called globalists and so on. It's important from a point of view of credibility and standing to denounce those who are on one's own side. President Biden is the leader of the Democratic Party, which has within it powerful currents and forces and leaders who are now trafficking in openly anti-Semitic and vehemently anti-Zionist tropes. And he owes it to the best traditions of the Democratic Party from Harry Truman onwards to Daniel Patrick Moynihan and so on to denounce them. If Republicans are going to denounce a bigot like Steve King, the congressman from Iowa, as they should have, right? It is unbelievable to me that someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez seems to suffer no consequence from deciding not to show up to a Yitzhak Rabin memorial. And Ilhan Omar more or less skirted right over her anti-Semitic controversies from a couple of years ago. So the best traditions in the United States have always come out when moderate leaders from the right or the left have provided some moral hygiene within their own ranks. And I know that President Biden is a genuine friend of Israel. There is a difference not only in tone, but in attitude when it comes to the Jewish state's predicaments. He's been around for a long time. He is not part of the New Left. He comes from a traditional wing of the party, and that's a party that deserves to be supported. And I would beg him, if I had 10 minutes of his time, to say, don't just go to the Holocaust Museum, go to Israel. Stand up for what this alliance between these two great democracies and these two great peoples mean, and say that you mean it, and say that it's forever, and denounce the new anti-Semitism of the left.
Thank you for that. Barry, same question for you. You're in the Oval Office, or maybe you're at Simone's Shabbat table, and you have 3 minutes with the President of the United States. What do you say to him?
I'll give you more.
Because they've just done a beautiful job. I would simply add, sorry, my dog is barking. I would simply add that in addition to everything Bret just said, let's be honest about where the Democratic Party is. The wind is at the sails of the squad. Chuck Schumer basically put out a one-sentence condemnation on Facebook. That's where we are now. So taking a hard look at that, we should look closely right now at who is standing up for us and who is not. Who is not willing to risk the political capital to stand up for our community? It is a very hard thing to look at, but I think that's important. I would suggest to Joe Biden, if I were sitting in the Oval Office, that he join hands with Richie Torres, that they put on giant kippot and they walk through the neighborhoods of places like Williamsburg and Crown Heights and Borough Park, where Jews have been regularly beaten. The most visible members of our community, maybe not the most popular ones, but the most visible members of our community for years. That is what they should do. They should walk through those neighborhoods with a rally of people, with Richie Torres right at the front, who's basically holding back a tsunami of anti-Zionism in his party, and march through the streets of Brooklyn. I think that would send an unequivocal signal about Joe Biden's priorities, about about where a lot of anti-Semitism is in the country right now, and anti-Semitism that's just much harder to take a hard look at.
I should note at this point that AJC is a nonpartisan organization. We have, of course, identified anti-Semitism from all parts of the political map, and we, of course, identify it on the extremes of both sides of that political map.
Yeah, let me just I feel like everyone always has to say that line, and it's without getting into detail, I've had to move because of anti-Semites. I have the synagogue where I grew up was the site of the most lethal attack. We all know that, right? It's that so few have the courage to call it out when it requires personal sacrifice. And that's what it requires. It is a moral gimme to condemn anti-Semites on the far right. It is so easy to tweet about Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it's fun too. But it's like what's being asked of our community right now, especially people in prominent positions, is personal sacrifice in their social life, personal sacrifice in their professional lives, personal sacrifice in terms of literal and political capital. That's what's on the table right now. And I think it's important for us to keep the focus on that because the rest, we know it. We've been doing it for the past 5 years. This is the new thing. And this is the thing that is uncomfortable because it requires a lot of skin in the game on our part.
And it's okay because in the long term, you don't want to be friends with those people anyway.
Yeah.
Probably true.
And they don't want to be friends with you. So just be honest.
I'm curious with Simone in the European context, if you feel like you've lost your mind because you've had to give over that message for 20 years now, and we're only now coming to it. Do you feel like you've lost your mind a little bit?
Listen, I mean, I have the impression, to be very frank, that you feel that you're shouting very, very loud, and sometimes people don't really hear you. So yes, I have not yet lost my mind, and I have not yet given up, and I don't think I will ever. But yes, it's very frustrating because again, you sort of have the impression that you've seen the movie already, and you know how it's going to end.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add one point, Avi? I don't know if our time is coming to an end, but I just want to add one point. At the end of the day, no matter what kind of Jew you are, and even if you're the most left-wing, progressive, non- or anti-traditional Jew, knowing everything we know about Jewish history, knowing how quickly countries can go from being historically friendly to Jews to being catastrophic for them, and that's what happened in Germany 90 years ago. The only real security that a Jew has in the world today is the state of Israel. The only one. We used to think that, well, the US couldn't possibly change because of our long traditions of tolerance and liberalism. We're seeing that change now. I hope it doesn't continue to change, but we're seeing it change now. So the only security a Jew has, even those who hate Israel, is Israel. And we should bear that in mind when we think about issues that profoundly affect the long-term security and health of the only Jewish state in some of the most dangerous and contested terrain in the world.
Thank you for those powerful words, Bret. I think we've come to our final question, and it's a very simple one, but perhaps the most consequential of this conversation. Where do we go from here? How do we, American Jews and our allies, fight back against this rising tide of anti-Semitism? And Simone, I'll give you the privilege of being the first to answer.
Thanks. Listen, first of all, I think what people have to understand, this is not going to go away. This is not just going to disappear on its own. So don't be complacent. Don't believe that the United States is different from anywhere else. Don't believe in that exceptionalism is going to save you. And that means you have to get involved. You have to get your hands dirty. It's going to be uncomfortable. Barry just mentioned, it can be socially dangerous. It can be uncomfortable at times, but that's the only way. It's your life. It's your children's lives. It's your country. So get involved with organizations, of course, organizations like AJC, but find anything, get involved. The other thing I would say is you have to convince people, allies, non-Jews, that at the end of the day, it's starting with anti-Semitism, but it's not going to end there. So the fight against anti-Semitism cannot be done alone by Jews. This is a problem that it's the symptom of the crisis that affects American liberal democracy. And unless it's dealt with it, unless we deal with the symptom and the underlying causes, not only Jews are doomed, but the rest of the country is doomed. And then maybe the last thing, for those of you who somehow think that by being less Jewish, by leaning more into anti-Israel, you will be able to feel a little bit more morally righteous, or you somehow have the belief that, you know, it will save you. The reality is, I think that you are only caving in. The reality is that you are only, in the name of some pseudo ideology, throwing fellow Jews under the bus. The reality is, I think that you are only strengthening profoundly radical ideas and illiberal forces. I think you really, really have to wake up.
Thank you for that. Bret, same question. How do we fight back?
You know, I think part of what makes a civilization civil is the ability to stay outraged by outrageous things. And the current demonization of Israel is an outrage. It's an intellectual and moral outrage. And its target is not Benjamin Netanyahu or evil right-wing Likudniks or one thing or you know, some specific force or another. It's ultimately the entire Jewish people, because no state in the world confronted with its set of challenges is treated in a similar way. And if we cannot, as a diaspora Jewish community, maintain that sense of outrage, if we continue to allow it to be normalized, if we continue to say that it's okay to suggest that Israel wantonly kills children, so long as it's, you're not saying that about us here in the United States, we are simply inviting that kind of discourse with all of its consequences to come to us. So we have to fight the battle at the front line, not several steps back. We have to call out these outrages as we see them. And sometimes that means being something of an obnoxious person. Bari and Simone have said it very, very eloquently. It will mean losing friends. It will mean losing social capital. That's okay. That's okay. Not being invited to certain dinner parties or getting onto certain shows is not the worst thing that can happen in life. And what you will discover instead in doing something that is, in the best sense of the word, righteous and true, is that you might help save your own soul and do something for your family and for your people. And nothing is more important than that.
Thank you, Bret. Bari, it's down to you. How do we fight back?
Well, first of all, this has been an honor. I admire every single person here so much and look to all of you for your moral courage. For me, it's a very Jewish answer because Simone and Bret have covered the rest. And I will simply say that the more that we root down into Jewish history and Jewish identity and the ideas that have transformed not just the Jewish people, but have transformed the world, the more we will be able to see what is asked of us in this moment. Jewish history is not just history. It is like a lighthouse. It is a moral manual for how to live. And if we look back to Jewish history, we will see two things. First of all, it will put whatever sacrifices are being asked of us right now into unbelievable perspective. If the worst thing that happens to you is that you have to leave a job at the New York Times or get ratioed on Twitter, think about what Natan Sharansky had to live through for the sake of defending the Jewish people. Think about what Hannah Senesh had to live through. Think about what Esther had to live through. Like, it's thousands of years. Choose anyone you want. And every one of those people had to sacrifice so much so that we could have the privilege, frankly, to get ratioed on the internet. Consider it a privilege and a badge of honor that that's what's being asked of us right now. That's the first thing. The second lesson we learn from Jewish history is not just sacrifice, it is that small groups of people, often from the fringes of Jewish society, have bent reality and changed the world. Herzl being one example, Avi, as we were talking about before we began, of a man who was putting up a Christmas tree in his home when the chief rabbi of Vienna came to visit him as he was writing The Jewish State. A man who during the Zionist Congress writes in his journal that the most nerve-wracking part of it was that he was asked to give an aliyah and he didn't know the words. That is the man who transformed Jewish history. We could go back. We could go back to the White Rose. We could go back all down the line. Oftentimes, Jewish leadership and Jewish visionaries and Jewish moral courage does not come from people that have the name president or CEO by their name. It comes from people often at the fringes of Jewish life. And so I would just say to everyone watching, if you think of yourself, I'm not a leader, I don't have a position of power, no. Teenagers have changed Jewish history. And so I think that is the very important thing for all of us to think about in our own life. How can we live up to the sacrifices that our ancestors made to make of these freedoms that we enjoy, to live by them, to live lives that are worthy of their sacrifice? So I would just say to everyone who's watching this, that's maybe despairing or grieving that the world that they inherited is no longer the world they're living in, think about Jewish history. Think about what other people have endured. That will give you perspective, and that will also give you, I think, incredible sense of power and of empowerment of what's possible for us to do right here and now.
Bari, Bret, Simone, thank you for a stimulating conversation and for helping us chart a way forward. Thank you all very, very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is William Scherr.
And I'm Caroline Scherr.
And we're both graduates of AJC's Leaders for Tomorrow program, also known as LIFT. I participated in the inaugural LIFT class in New York in 2015 and just graduated from Cornell University.
And I finished the LIFT program in 2019 and just wrapped up my first year at Cornell. Getting involved with AJC has helped us both to grow. Because of AJC, we're better Jewish leaders and advocates.
Participating in LIFT has given us so many opportunities to reimagine what's possible for both ourselves and for the Jewish people. It prepared us to be leaders on campus, arming us with the tools to combat anti-Semitism in a changing world, as well as giving us guidance on how to advocate smartly for Israel and for the Jewish people.
In the LIFT program, we not only learned about Israel's history and modern-day challenges, but we also learned how to channel our love and support for the state of Israel into effective advocacy at school and in our communities.
At the same time, AJC has continued to provide us with opportunities to stay engaged, whether at the AJC Virtual Global Forum or with programs through AJC's regional offices. A few years ago, I was beyond lucky to have the chance to travel to Israel with 4 fellow LIFT participants, specifically for a discussion with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. It was just us 5 and the Prime Minister. How many Jewish organizations would have the trust and vision to make such an investment in high schoolers? During the conversation, I asked him about the relationship between Israel and the Gulf states. Little did I know that just a few years later, Israel and 2 Gulf states would sign normalization deals. I am so grateful to AJC for enabling me to be a part of this opportunity and this history.
With most classes at Cornell returning to in-person learning in the fall, I'm looking forward to building on my experiences in the LIFT program. And I know that if I run into challenges, and there's a good likelihood I will, AJC is there to guide me along the way. To everyone supporting AJC at this year's Virtual Global Forum, thank you. Thank you for making it possible for student advocates like Will and me to speak up for Israel and the Jewish people on our college campuses. Thank you for investing in the Jewish future.
Thank you very much for allowing me to share a few remarks with you. I am Alejandro Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security. My relationship with the American Jewish Committee goes back many years. When I lived in Los Angeles, Bruce Raymer, one of the pillars, one of the icons of the legal community in Los Angeles and our nation, introduced me to AJC. And AJC in Los Angeles was led then by Rabbi Gary Greenenbaum. And I learned very quickly and very fundamentally the importance of the work of AJC for the Jewish community and for our nation and our people around the world. My identity as a Jew is a very important part of who I am. And the issue of anti-Semitism was uppermost in our consciousness throughout my upbringing. My mother fled Romania and then France with her parents and her aunt and uncle and arrived safely in Cuba, but lost a tremendous amount of family in the Holocaust. And my mother instilled in me a deep and profound understanding of the fragility of life and the need to adhere to our Jewish principles and never lose sight of our identity and the fact that it could be under attack at any time. And so to stand up and stand strong. And that is the ethic that I bring to the Department of Homeland Security and our work as we combat a clear increase in anti-Semitism around the country and the world, and as we face what I have termed to be the greatest terrorism-related threat on our homeland, and that is the threat of domestic violent extremism. When I speak of my consciousness of anti-Semitism as a youth, let me bring that to life a little bit. I probably had 2, maybe 3 sleepovers throughout my entire youth. Sleeping over at somebody's home was something that, quite frankly, brought fear to my mother. The notion of sleepaway camp was something that she could not wrap her arms around. And so the decisions that were made for me, the reasons that were explained to me, became a very significant part of how I looked at issues of fragility and identity and endurance and remembrance and fight for the ability to believe in one's faith without compromise. The Department of Homeland Security has responsibilities to combat anti-Semitism, but more importantly, or I should say more immediately, the nexus between anti-Semitism and other ideologies of hate and acts of violence. That is where we, as a Department of Homeland Security, bring to bear our resources, our capabilities, and our talent. We very well understand the constitutional principle of free speech and the fact that individuals are free to articulate their ideologies of hate, no matter how pernicious. But there cannot be a connection between those ideologies of hate and acts of violence that injure and harm others. And so in executing our responsibilities to make sure that that connection does not occur, we have significant lines of action. First and foremost, we disseminate information to our local communities, our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to equip them with the information that they need to better protect themselves on the front lines. And that's not just law enforcement, but institutions of faith as well. We work very closely, for example, with Michael Masters and the Secure Community Network that is sponsored by the Jewish Federation in making sure that houses of worship, day schools, and other institutions of faith within the American Jewish community are equipped with the information they need to be safe and secure. We do that, of course, not just with respect to SCN, but with respect to all faiths and all communities that might be subject to ideologies of hate that could most tragically lead to actions of violence and harm. We also disseminate money. We distribute money through grants to equip institutions and organizations with the resources they need to better secure themselves. I articulated at the very outset in my confirmation hearing the fact that I view the Department of Homeland Security as a department of partnership. We are a partner not only of individuals of one faith, but a partner with individuals of all faiths, of all communities, those who may not follow a particular ideology or who may not, in fact, believe in God. Our responsibility is to protect each and every individual in the United States, to bring to bear the room and the space to follow whatever one's beliefs are without threat of violence and harm. I am incredibly proud of my identity. I am incredibly proud of my history with the American Jewish Committee. I'm incredibly grateful for the work that you do, and I look forward to our partnership and partnership with many, many communities throughout the months and years ahead. Thank you so much.